Sophia adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform. What would you do if someone tried to take what was rightfully yours, simply because they believed they deserved it more? On what seemed like an ordinary flight, one woman's quiet strength transformed a moment of entitlement into a powerful lesson no one on board would ever forget. Stay tuned, this is a story of resilience, surprising twists and well-deserved karma. Before we dive in, tell us where you are watching from today in the comments. If you love stories of courage, justice and empowerment, do not forget to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Now let us get into it. The gentle hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin. As Amara Brooks eased into her luxurious, first-class seat, she exhaled, savoring the moment of calm after a demanding week of high-stakes meetings. Her window seat offered an unmatched view of the runway, as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. This brief luxury was not something she took for granted, it was something she had earned. For Amara, this flight was not just another trip. It was the start of a new chapter. As the CEO of Brooks Innovations, a leading tech firm she had built from the ground up, she was flying to finalize a massive international deal, a partnership that would cement her company's future and open doors to opportunities she had only dreamed of. Her journey had not been easy. Growing up in the modest neighborhood of East Willow, Amara's parents had instilled in her a strong work ethic and an unshakable belief that she could break barriers society had placed in her path. And she had done just that, rising above challenges to claim her seat at the table, in the boardroom and now in first class. She adjusted the light silk scarf around her neck, its soft fabric a small comfort, and reached for her polished leather briefcase. Around her the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered, mingling with the faint trace of luxury perfumes. A flight attendant passed by, flashing a warm, practiced smile as he handed Amara a glass of sparkling water. "Thank you," she said with a polite nod, savoring the cool fizz as it touched her lips. For a moment everything was perfect. But perfection, as Amara would soon learn, does not always last. A sudden commotion near the front of the cabin broke the peaceful atmosphere. Amara glanced up, her sharp gaze landing on a tall, blonde woman who had just entered. Her presence radiated entitlement, her posture proud, her designer handbag dangling off her elbow like a trophy. Behind her trailed another woman, slightly shorter, her nervous demeanor contrasting sharply with her companion's confidence. As they reached Amara's row, snippets of their conversation floated through the air. "Can you believe this nonsense?" The blonde woman scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. "They have clearly messed up the seat assignments. I am sure it is just a mix-up." Marissa, her friend, whispered nervously, offering a half-hearted laugh. Amara felt a ripple of unease, but did not look up from her briefcase. She had encountered people like Marissa Caldwell before, individuals who judged her first by the color of her skin before considering her accomplishments. "Excuse me." Marissa's clipped voice broke into Amara's thoughts. Amara looked up calmly, meeting Marissa's gaze. "Yes." Marissa flashed a strained smile, though her eyes were cold. "I think there has been a mistake," she said, gesturing vaguely toward Amara's seat. "This seat, my seat, has clearly been given to you in error." Amara blinked once, her expression steady. "This is seat 1, she replied, her voice even. "I booked it weeks ago." Marissa's smile faltered. "You see," she said, her tone condescending, "I am a Gold Premier member with this airline. I always sit here. You would probably be more comfortable in another seat, maybe somewhere farther back." A beat of silence hung between them as Amara studied Marissa. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. "Almost. I am perfectly comfortable right here," Amara said calmly. "Thank you." Marissa's polished mask cracked, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Her friend shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly wishing she could melt into the floor. Before Marissa could escalate further, a flight attendant appeared at the row. His neatly pressed uniform in polite but firm tone immediately lent authority to the moment. "Is there an issue here, madam?" he asked, glancing between Amara and Marissa. "Yes," Marissa said, her voice now adopting a theatrical lilt. This seat, my seat, has been given to someone else. I need this sorted out immediately. The attendant turned to Amara, offering her a faintly skeptical look. May I check your boarding pass, madam? Without a word, Amara Brooks handed over her boarding pass, her movements deliberate and composed. Her heartbeat remained steady, despite the rising tension. She had been here before, in boardrooms, on conference stages, and in countless subtle encounters where her presence was questioned, and she had to prove she belonged. This was just another test, one she had no intention of failing. The flight attendant, a young man with careful professionalism, studied the boarding pass. After a beat, he straightened and nodded. This is indeed your seat, Miss Brooks. For a brief moment, Marissa Caldwell's carefully polished exterior cracked. Her eyes narrowed in frustration, her lips parting in disbelief. That can't be right, she muttered, her voice sharp. She must have upgraded at the last minute. People do that, do not they? Amara resisted the urge to respond, with a cutting remark instead. She held Marissa's gaze with steady composure. I suggest you take the seat you are assigned, she said quietly, her voice calm but unyielding. This conversation is over. Marissa's companion, a petite woman with dark hair, Lydia, Amara thought she had heard her name earlier, shifted uncomfortably. She tugged gently at Marissa's sleeve, whispering something inaudible, clearly urging her to let it go. But Marissa was not ready to back down. I am not sure you understand who I am, she said, her voice lowering, though the anger simmering beneath it was obvious. I always fly first class. I am not about to let someone like Marissa stop. Lydia whispered sharply, cutting her off before Marissa could respond. The flight attendant cleared his throat, stepping forward with a tone that brooked no argument. I am sorry, madam, but if you have further concerns, you are welcome to speak with our supervisor. Marissa glared at him, her frustration barely contained. Her chest rose, as if she were preparing for another outburst, but after a long seething moment, she exhaled in a huff. Fine, she snapped. Turning on her heel, she stormed toward the front of the cabin, her reluctant friend trailing behind. As they disappeared from view, the flight attendant turned back to Amara, his expression apologetic. I am sorry for the inconvenience, Miss Brooks, he said quietly. Before retreating to attend to his other duties, Amara gave him a polite nod, but said nothing instead. She watched Marissa's retreating figure, her expression carefully unreadable. She could feel the curious stares of the other passengers, their silent judgment weighing on the air like a heavy fog. This was not the first time she had been singled out, made to feel like an outsider in a space she had every right to occupy, and she knew deep down that it would not be the last. But today, Amara was not about to let anyone diminish her worth. Not today, not ever. Leaning back in her seat, she took a small sip of sparkling water and closed her eyes for a brief moment. The tension still lingered, but she had weathered it as always. Yet instinct told her this was far from over. After a few minutes, Amara opened her sleek leather notebook, its cover worn from years of use. Each page was filled with her meticulous handwriting. Strategies, notes, and plans for the deal she was set to finalize overseas. She adjusted her reading glasses, her focus returning to the work that mattered most. The faint click of the cabin door opening pulled her attention away. Once again, the final wave of passengers was beginning to board, and Amara caught sight of another figure entering the first-class cabin. A tall woman with platinum blonde hair, swept up in a precise twist, moved into view. She was dressed in a pristine cream blazer, her posture immaculate, exuding the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of getting exactly what one wants. Behind her trailed yet another companion, a frazzled woman carrying an oversized tote. The blonde, clearly Vanessa Hale, paused midway down the aisle, and at her sharp gaze, scanning the rows of seats like a hawk, searching for prey, her eyes landed on Amara. Narrowing subtly, though her lips held the faintest shadow of a smile, Amara recognized the look. It was that all too familiar mix of curiosity and judgment, accompanied by the unspoken question. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa raised a manicured hand, flagging down a passing flight attendant with a sharp wave. "Excuse me, she said, her voice carrying an edge of impatience. "There must be a mistake. My seat is supposed to be here." The flight attendant, a young man with neatly combed hair and a slight air of nervousness, offered her a polite smile. "What seat number, madam?" "One, of course," Vanessa replied curtly, her tone dismissive. She gestured vaguely toward Amara, her finger pointed like an accusation. But clearly there has been some sort of mix-up. Amara felt her heart sink, not from fear but from sheer exhaustion. She knew exactly where this was going. The flight attendant pulled out his tablet, his fingers scrolling across the screen. After a moment he glanced up with an apologetic smile. "I am sorry, madam, but seat 1 was reserved in advance by Miss Brooks." Vanessa's jaw tightened, the muscles in her face visibly clenching. "And what am I supposed to do about that?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "I am a loyal customer of this airline, a very loyal customer. Surely there is some accommodation you can make." The attendant hesitated, glancing toward Amara, whose expression remained calm but firm. "There is nothing to arrange," Amara interjected, her voice smooth but resolute. She looked up, meeting Vanessa's gaze squarely. "This is my seat and I intend to keep it." For a brief moment Vanessa blinked, startled by the steadiness in Amara's tone. "Well," she said, after recovering, her voice dripping with condescension, "I am sure you would be much more comfortable in another seat, perhaps business class." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and insulting. Amara did not flinch. She had spent years in corporate boardrooms, facing people who underestimated her worth and questioned her place. This was no different. "I am perfectly comfortable where I am," Amara replied evenly. The tension in the first-class cabin sharpened. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice suddenly seemed engrossed in their screens or books, though Amara could feel their curiosity buzzing around her like an invisible current. Before Vanessa could press further, the flight attendant spoke up, his voice quick and conciliatory. "Let me handle this, madam. I will see if there is something we can do." Vanessa did not reply, though. The irritation etched into her features made it clear she was not done. Amara leaned back, steady and unshaken. Whatever came next, she was ready. The flight attendant's attempt to de-escalate the situation came with a veneer of politeness that grated on Amara Brooks' nerves. Turning toward her, he spoke with forced calm. "Mrs. Brooks, would you mind relocating to another seat? Perhaps 2C. It is still in first class and would allow us to accommodate Mrs. Hale." So that was her name, Amara thought. Vanessa Hale, the kind of name tied to country clubs, generational wealth and old-world entitlement. Amara leaned back in her seat, folding her arms across her chest in a relaxed but resolute posture. "I booked this seat for a reason," she replied, her voice firm and measured. "I won't be moving." Vanessa's face darkened. "Unbelievable," she muttered loudly enough for Amara to hear, as if hoping to garner sympathy from the surrounding passengers. Turning back to the flight attendant, her frustration spilled over. "Do you even know who I am?" she demanded. "I am a Premier Elite member with this airline. I do not think this is how you want to treat one of your most loyal customers." The attendant swallowed nervously, shifting his weight as his gaze flicked between Vanessa and Amara. Amara could see the hesitation in his expression, the unspoken conflict playing out behind his eyes. He knew Vanessa had connections, and yet he also knew Amara was within her rights. In this silent power struggle, Amara could already sense where his loyalty leaned. "I will get the supervisor," the attendant finally said, before retreating down the aisle. Vanessa turned her attention back to Amara, her lips curling into a forced saccharine smile. "You could have avoided all this, you know," she said, her tone dripping with fox sweetness. "But I suppose some people just do not understand the meaning of compromise." Amara tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes studying Vanessa with quiet intensity. "Compromise," she repeated softly, as if testing the word on her tongue. Interesting choice of words. Vanessa's smug expression faltered ever so slightly, but before she could respond, the supervisor arrived. A middle-aged woman in a crisp navy uniform, her presence commanded immediate attention. Her polished, black heels clicked sharply against the cabin floor. As she approached the scene, "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked. Her tone authoritative but carefully neutral. Her gaze swept between Amara and Vanessa. Before Amara could respond, Vanessa seized the opportunity. "Yes, there is a problem," she said sharply, gesturing toward Amara as though she were an obstacle, rather than a person I am supposed to be in seat 1. But somehow she ended up here. The supervisor's gaze landed on Amara. For the briefest moment something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Miss Brooks," she began cautiously, keeping her tone professional, "would you consider moving to another seat? It is still in first class, and it would help us resolve this quickly." Amara's fingers tightened around the armrest. She looked at the supervisor, then at Vanessa and finally at the other passengers, who were now fully invested in the unfolding drama, despite their best efforts to appear otherwise. She could feel their silent expectations, the unspoken pressure for her to yield, to be the one to compromise, for the sake of keeping the peace. "No," Amara said simply, her voice unwavering. Vanessa let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head, as if Amara's resolve were some personal affront. "You are really going to make a scene over this?" Amara's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her gaze remained steely. "Let us," she replied softly. She pulled out her phone, her calm demeanor never wavering as she began typing a message. Her movements were deliberate, unbothered, even as the air in the cabin grew thicker with tension. The supervisor, Diana Lang, shifted uncomfortably. Years of experience as a senior airline professional had prepared her for difficult passengers, but something about this situation felt different. Diana had encountered entitled travelers before, but Vanessa Hale was in a category all her own. She was the type of person who believed her mere presence deserved priority treatment. Rules and fairness be damned. Diana turned her attention back to Amara, who remained seated with a quiet, undeniable power. There was something unshackable about her, an air of authority that commanded respect without her needing to raise her voice. It was alarming, even unsettling, and Diana hesitated. "Miss Brooks," Diana said carefully, trying to maintain her professional neutrality, "I understand your position, but for the sake of resolving this smoothly, would you please reconsider moving?" Amara did not even look up from her phone. "I paid for this seat," she said, her voice firm but devoid of anger. "I am not moving." Diana pressed her lips into a thin line. Clearly uneasy, she glanced at Vanessa, who had started pacing a small circle in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Vanessa's face was flushed, a mix of indignation and impatience written across her features. "Diana," Vanessa interjected, her voice sharp with entitlement, "I do not understand why this is even a discussion. She is being unreasonable. I am a Premier Elite member. Do you know how much money I have spent on this airline? I probably make more in a year than enough." Amara cut in quietly, her voice slicing through Vanessa's tirade like a blade. Vanessa blinked momentarily, thrown off by the calm authority in Amara's tone. Amara finally looked up from her phone, locking eyes with her. "Your status does not entitle you to what is mine," she said evenly, "and it does not exempt you from respecting other people." The quiet in the cabin deepened. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, though no one dared to speak. Diana stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her shoulders. The words sat in the air like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting between the two women, though none dared intervene. Amara Brooks finally looked up, her gaze locking onto Vanessa Hale, with startling intensity. "Mrs. Hale," Amara said slowly, her voice smooth yet edged with steel, "your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that is their problem, not mine." Vanessa's cheeks flushed, her polished facade beginning to crumble. "This is not about the money," she snapped, though her voice wavered slightly. "It is about respect. People like you She stopped mid-sentence as if realizing she had walked herself to the edge of dangerous territory. Amara arched an eyebrow, her expression unwavering. "People like me," she repeated softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words hit like thunder. The cabin fell into absolute silence. Even Diana Lang, the flight supervisor, seemed to shrink under Amara's gaze, her earlier authority tempered by discomfort. Vanessa hesitated, floundering for words, as her confidence visibly faltered. "I did not mean it like that," she stammered. "I just meant well. You are clearly not someone who flies first class often." "Stop," Amara said firmly, holding up a hand. The single word cut through Vanessa's stammering like a razor. "You have said enough." The authority in Amara's voice made Vanessa recoil. Slightly, though, she quickly masked her discomfort with a toss of her head, her haughty composure clinging by a thread. Turning back to Diana, Vanessa demanded, "Are you seriously going to let her get away with this?" Diana felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her as a senior supervisor. She was trained to de-escalate tensions and prioritize customer satisfaction. But this was not an ordinary situation. There was something about Amara, something in the calm strength of her demeanor, that warned Diana against pushing too far. "I am afraid Miss Brooks has every right to remain in her seat," Diana said at last, her voice carefully measured. "She booked it and we cannot force her to move." Vanessa's face twisted in fury. "Unbelievable," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. "This is the kind of service I get after all the money I have spent with this airline. I will be speaking to corporate about this. Mark my words, you do that." Amara replied coolly, turning her attention back to her phone, as if Vanessa were no more than a fleeting distraction. Vanessa, however, was not done. Storming down the aisle in a flurry of indignation, she muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "Entitled people and incompetent staff." Her companion Lydia followed reluctantly, casting an apologetic glance toward Amara. As they disappeared toward the front of the cabin, Diana let out a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. Moments later, Vanessa returned, flanked by the flight attendant Tom, whose expression was an uneasy mix of confusion and alarm. Clearly, Vanessa had decided to escalate. "She refuses to cooperate," Vanessa announced loudly, gesturing toward Amara as though addressing an unruly child. "I demand that you do something about this." Tom looked at Amara, then back at Vanessa. His face torn. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Every passenger now openly watching the confrontation unfold. Tom turned toward Diana, silently asking for guidance. Before Diana could respond, Amara stood up. The sudden movement drew every pair of eyes in the cabin. A collective breath seemed to hold as Amara moved deliberately and with precision. Reaching into her blazer pocket, she pulled out her phone and pressed a button. A faint ringtone hummed through the cabin. "I did not want to do this," Amara said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She glanced at Tom and Diana, her gaze cold and calculating. "But since you have decided to escalate, I will escalate too." She turned her back to Vanessa and spoke into the phone, her tone professional but edged with irritation. "Yes, it is Amara Brooks," she said crisply. "I am currently on flight 615 to Oslo, and I am having an issue with the staff." Vanessa's face contorted into confusion, her indignation momentarily faltering. Tom shifted awkwardly, his hands wringing nervously, while Diana's face visibly paled. "No, I am not looking for compensation," Amara continued into the phone, her voice unwavering. "I am looking for accountability. I expect a resolution before we take off. If I do not get one, I will assume this is a systemic issue and take it directly to the board." She paused, letting her words linger, before adding a quiet "thank you." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket, with the same precision she would use to pull it out. Turning to Diana, she offered a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Now," Amara said, her voice dripping with quiet authority, "let us see how corporate handles this." Diana swallowed hard the weight of the situation, settling fully on her shoulders. She did not know who Amara Brooks was, not exactly, but everything about her demeanor, her composure, her words. The subtle air of power she exuded made one thing clear. This was not a battle they wanted to lose. The first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the airplane's engines was the only sound filling the heavy silence. Amara Brooks flipped open her notebook again. The soft rustle of the pages cutting through the heavy silence like a deliberate punctuation mark. It was a gesture of finality, as though the conversation had already been resolved, entirely in her favor. Standing nearby in the aisle, Diana Lang's usually composed demeanor was faltering. The words Amara had spoken, "Take it to the board," echoed ominously in her mind, each syllable ringing like a warning bell. Diana had faced her share of difficult passengers before, but there was something about Amara's quiet authority that unsettled her deeply. Her instincts told her this was not just another dispute, and yet Vanessa Hale stood there like a storm brewing. She had her arms crossed tightly, her manicured nails tapping irritably against the sleeve of her designer jacket. The smirk she had worn earlier had disappeared, replaced with a deep scowl that darkened her face. Finally breaking the silence, Vanessa turned to Diana, her tone laced with indignation and impatience. "Are you just going to stand there and let this nonsense continue?" Diana hesitated, her eyes shifting briefly to Tom, the flight attendant standing awkwardly behind Vanessa. His posture was stiff, his discomfort written clearly on his face. Diana knew she was walking a precarious tightrope. If she sided with Vanessa, a premier elite member, she risked angering Amara, a woman who had made it abundantly clear she had connections high enough to shake the airline. But siding with Amara would mean directly opposing Vanessa, someone the airline considered a valued, frequent customer. Either choice felt like stepping into quicksand. "Mrs. Hale," Diana began cautiously, her voice carefully neutral, "I assure you we are handling the situation. Please return to your seat for now, and I will follow up shortly." Vanessa's eyes narrowed dangerously, her nostrils flaring. "Take my seat." "Take my seat," she repeated, incredulous. Her voice pitched higher, loud enough that a few passengers visibly winced. She jabbed a finger in Amara's direction. "Do you have any idea who I am?" It was a phrase Amara had heard more times than she cared to count. This time she did not even look up from her notebook. Calmly she turned a page, as though Vanessa's tantrum was no more significant than a passing breeze. Her nonchalance only seemed to stoke Vanessa's anger. "Further, I demand to speak to the captain." Vanessa snapped sharply, "This is completely unacceptable. If you won't fix this, I will take it up with someone who will." Diana's confident veneer cracked ever so slightly at the mention of the captain. Involving the captain in a passenger dispute was a last resort, one that risked delaying the entire flight. She stepped forward, her voice softening in an attempt to contain the situation. "Mrs. Hale," Diana said firmly, "please understand that the captain's priority is the safety of the flight. This matter does not warrant his involvement. Let us resolve this here." But Vanessa was not hearing it. She scoffed loud and derisive. "Oh, I see how it is." She sneered, her voice dripping with bitterness. "You are protecting her because you think she is more important than me. Well, let me tell you something. If I am not in that seat before this plane takes off, your airline will be hearing from my lawyers." The cabin felt suffocatingly quiet, every passenger holding their breath. Amara sighed softly and for the first time closed her notebook with a deliberate thud. She set it gently on her lap and looked up, her gaze meeting Vanessa's with a calm intensity that seemed to freeze time. "Mrs. Hale," Amara said evenly, her voice a calm blade, "if you truly believe your lawyers can resolve this, then by all means proceed. But before you do, I would suggest considering the consequences of escalating a situation you are clearly unprepared to handle." Vanessa blinked, momentarily thrown off. "What is that supposed to mean?" she demanded, though her voice wavered for the first time. Amara leaned forward slightly, her expression as composed as ever. "It means," she said softly, That throwing your weight around might work in some circles, but it won't work here, not with me. And certainly not with the board members, who will be reviewing this incident. Amara sat back, her face neutral, but her eyes sharp as glass. So I suggest you take your seat, before you embarrass yourself any further. A beat of silence followed, so heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin. Diana looked between the two women, her stomach twisting itself into knots. She could see Vanessa's face redden, her jaw clenching, as she tried and failed to formulate a response. Before she could recover, a deep, authoritative voice broke through the silence. "Ladies." The sound came from behind them, and every head turned. The captain himself had appeared at the entrance of the first-class cabin. His uniform was immaculate, his demeanor calm yet commanding. Even Vanessa fell silent, as his presence filled the space like a tide. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of practiced neutrality that comes from years of leadership. "Captain, we are handling a minor seating issue. There is no need for your involvement," Diana Lang said quickly, her voice strained but polite. "I will be the judge of that," the captain interrupted, his tone calm but resolute as he surveyed the tense scene. He turned his attention to Vanessa Hale, who wasted no time launching into an indignant tirade. Her voice was loud and filled with self-righteous anger, as she detailed her Premier Elite member status, her years of loyalty to the airline, and the supposed injustice of being denied her rightful seat. The captain listened patiently, his expression unreadable. Not once did he interrupt as Vanessa rattled off her grievances. When Vanessa finally paused, out of breath but still fuming, he turned to Amara Brooks. His gaze softened slightly as he addressed her. "And you, madam?" he asked, his tone professional, but gentler than it had been with Vanessa. "Do you have anything to add?" Amira met his eyes without hesitation. "No, Captain," she said evenly. "I paid for this seat and I intend to stay in it. If the airline made a mistake with Mrs. Hale's reservation, that is unfortunate, but it is not my responsibility to fix." The captain gave a small nod, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer, before he turned back to Vanessa. "Mrs. Hale," he said firmly, his tone brooking no argument, "I understand your frustration, but this seat is properly assigned to Miss Brooks. I must ask you to return to your assigned seat so we can proceed with the flight." Vanessa's mouth opened and closed, her outrage momentarily rendering her speechless. She glanced around the cabin, searching desperately for support, but found only the careful avoidance of her fellow passengers' gazes. Not a single person seemed willing to take her side. "That is final," the captain said sharply, cutting off whatever rebuttal Vanessa was about to make. "If you refuse, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight." A collective gasp swept through the cabin, the tension in the air almost tangible. Vanessa looked around again, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she could not comprehend how the situation had turned against her so decisively, her hands clenched into fists, her manicured nails digging into her palms. "This is not over," she hissed, glaring at Amara with a venomous intensity, as though the entire ordeal was her fault. But Amara did not flinch, she did not even look up. For Vanessa, that was the greatest insult of all. With a final furious stomp, Vanessa spun on her heel and stormed down the aisle, her angry footsteps echoing loudly in the hushed cabin. She retreated to her assigned seat, radiating indignation like a storm cloud. The cabin remained thick with tension, an uneasy silence falling over the passengers. They shifted in their seats, avoiding each other's eyes, but clearly processing what they had just witnessed. The captain turned to Diana and gave her a brief nod, signaling that the matter was resolved for now. Then, without another word, he returned to the cockpit. Diana exhaled quietly, her usually composed demeanor shaken. The weight of the confrontation lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. She could feel the tension clinging to her, like the stiff collar of her uniform pressing uncomfortably against her neck. While Vanessa had been pacified temporarily, the simmering look in her eyes promised retribution. And then there was Amara, silent, composed yet undeniably powerful. Diana could not shake the feeling that this incident was not over. Amara, meanwhile, flipped open her notebook once again, her fingers tracing the edges of the leather cover, as if grounding herself. Her calm exterior was a practiced art, but beneath it she felt a faint ripple of frustration. This was not the first time she had encountered such blatant entitlement, and, though she rarely allowed such things to unsettle her, today felt different. Maybe it was Vanessa's audacity, or the crew's complicit hesitation, but something inside her had shifted. Her phone buzzed softly in the pocket of her blazer. Amara pulled it out with a fluid motion, her expression sharpening as she read the name on the screen, Marcus Corporate Affairs. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Marcus was efficient, sharp, and fiercely loyal. A trusted ally on the corporate board of the airline. If anyone could handle this situation with the urgency and precision it deserved, it was him. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice low to maintain discretion. "Marcus," she said, her tone steady but laced with irritation. "I need you to handle something." There was a pause on the other end before Marcus replied, his voice calm and professional. "I saw your message. What is going on?" Amara glanced around the cabin, ensuring her conversation remained private. "I am on Flight 412 to Oslo," she began. "The crew just tried to pressure me into giving up my seat for another passenger, a premier elite member who thinks the world revolves around her." Marcus's sharp intake of breath was audible through the line. What I wish I were kidding." Amara said dryly. "It was not just a polite request, Marcus. It was a thinly veiled attempt to prioritize her over me, because in their eyes she is more valuable. When I refused, they escalated. The supervisor even asked me again, as if I had not already made myself clear." Marcus's tone darkened, his professionalism unable to mask his anger. "This is unacceptable. Do you have names?" "I do," Amara replied coolly. "The flight attendant is Tom, the supervisor is Diana Lang, and of course Mrs. Hale herself. I will escalate this to the CO myself. They will be lucky to keep their jobs by the time you land." Amara Brooks heard Marcus say firmly through the phone. She paused, her fingers tightening around the device. "Do not stop at firing them," she said quietly but with unmistakable determination. "I want a systemic review. This is not just about me. It is about how many others have been treated like this. I am tired of these exceptions becoming the norm." Marcus's voice softened, his respect for her evident. "Understood. I will start the process immediately. In the meantime, is there anything else you need?" Amara's gaze drifted to the window. The fiery hues of the sunset had faded into the soft twilight, and the runway lights flickered faintly against the deepening sky. She exhaled slowly, studying her thoughts. "No," she said at last. "Handle the rest from here." She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket. For a moment she allowed herself a deep breath, the rhythmic beating of her heart grounding her amidst the tension. The storm was not over, but she had set things in motion. All she had to do now was wait. Across the aisle, Diana Lang watched Amara from the corner of her eye. The quiet confidence with which Amara had conducted herself was not just intimidating, it was deeply unsettling. Diana had dealt with her fair share of demanding passengers during her years with the airline, but none had carried the quiet authority that Amara exuded. There was something about her calm, unshakable demeanor that suggested she was not just another first-class traveler. Diana glanced toward the galley where Tom, the flight attendant, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. His usual air of confidence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget. With his tie steeling herself, Diana stepped into the narrow space, her voice low but firm. "Tom, we need to talk." He straightened immediately, his expression defensive about what the situation. Diana replied, lowering her voice even further to avoid being overheard. "I do not think you realize who we are dealing with." Tom scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "She is just another passenger who thinks she is above everyone else. I do not see what the big deal is." Diana frowned, her tone sharp. "She is not just another passenger, Tom. Did you see how she handled this? She did not even raise her voice, but she is already escalated outside the chain of command. I think we have made a mistake." Tom shifted uncomfortably. the weight of Diana's words settling heavily on him. "You think she is connected?" he asked hesitantly. "I do not think." Diana said, "I know. And I think we need to be careful. You need to be prepared for the possibility that this might come back on us." Tom opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the calm, measured voice over the speakers. "We have received an update from corporate headquarters and will be making a brief delay at the gate before takeoff. We appreciate your patience and will provide additional details shortly." The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. Diana's stomach dropped. A delay at this stage could only mean one thing. Corporate was already involved. Turning to Tom, she spoke softly but firmly. "This is not over." Tom said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time, he realized that they had underestimated Amara Brooks, and that mistake could cost them dearly. The hum of the engines had quieted, replaced by the faint rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. Conversations were muted, unease spreading through the cabin as the unexpected delay sank in. Amara, meanwhile, closed her notebook again, resting her hands on the smooth leather cover. Her outward calm remained intact, but the sharpness in her eyes hinted at the mental chess game she was already winning. She glanced out the window, the faint glow of the terminal lights reflecting on the glass. This pause, she knew, was not coincidental. Marcus worked quickly, and if he was already pulling strings, things were about to unfold in ways no one here could predict. Back in the galley, Diana and Tom huddled in hushed tones. Their earlier tension had now given way to outright fear. "I do not like this," Diana muttered. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her years of hard work and diplomacy had earned her a solid reputation, but she could feel it crumbling beneath her feet. "That delay," she continued. Her voice strained. "It is corporate. Someone called it in." Tom leaned back against the counter, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a restless energy that made him seem smaller somehow. "So what if they did?" he asked, though his voice lacked conviction. "It is not like we did anything wrong. We asked her to move politely and she refused." End of story. Diana shook her head, her frustration evident. "You are missing the point, Tom. This is not about what we think we did. It is about perception, and if she is connected to someone high enough to trigger a delay like this, that perception could destroy us." Tom scoffed, but his shifting gaze betrayed his unease. "She is just another passenger who is good at bluffing," he muttered. "Probably knows someone in customer service and thought she could scare us. I am telling you, it is nothing." But even as he spoke, Tom felt the weight of Diana's words settle on him like a heavy stone. He had dealt with disgruntled passengers before, some who threatened escalation, but none had displayed the quiet certainty that Amara Brooks had. This was not a bluff, it was a warning. Back in the first-class cabin, Vanessa Hale sat rigidly in her assigned seat, her fingers tapping against the armrest in an impatient rhythm. The delay had done nothing to ease her temper. If anything, it had poured fuel on the fire. She could not stop replaying the image of Amara's composed face, the way she had so effortlessly dismissed her demands, as though Vanessa was insignificant. "She thinks she is better than me," Vanessa muttered under her breath, her lips curling into a sneer. Beside her, Lydia, who had supported her earlier, now shifted uncomfortably. Her confidence in Vanessa's cause had dwindled into a pit of unease. "Maybe we should just let it go," Lydia whispered cautiously, her eyes darting toward the aisle, where Diana and Tom were still talking. "This is getting messy." Vanessa shot her a withering look, her voice venomous. "Let it go. Do you have any idea how much money I have spent with this airline? How many hours I have logged in first class? I am not letting some nobody make a fool of me." Lydia winced at Vanessa's tone, but said nothing more, retreating into the in-flight magazine in her lap. Vanessa, however, was not finished. Leaning forward, she craned her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of Amara. There she was, sitting serenely in her seat, her focus once again on her notebook. "Unbelievable," Vanessa hissed. She just sits there acting like she owns the place. A passing flight attendant caught her eye, and Vanessa flagged him down with an abrupt wave of her hand. "Are we taking off yet?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the cabin's quiet. "This delay is unacceptable." The young man hesitated, caught off guard by her tone. "I am sorry, madam, but the captain has not provided an update yet. We should be underway shortly." Vanessa waved him off dismissively. Muttering under her breath as he retreated down the aisle, she cast one last glance toward Amara, who had not even looked up from her notebook. For Vanessa, that silent indifference only stoked her simmering rage. Amara glanced up briefly from her seat, catching Diana and Tom's anxious figures in the galley. She did not need to hear their conversation to know what was being said. The gears had already been set in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Reopening her notebook, she let her fingers graze the edges of its pages, grounding herself once more. The storm brewing around her was no longer her concern. The corporate delay had come faster than she expected, a testament to Marcus's efficiency. She smiled faintly to herself, her calm exterior belying the power moves happening behind the scenes. In her mind the outcome was already clear. 15 minutes later, the stillness of the cabin was broken by the soft hiss of the cabin door opening. Two sharply dressed men in tailored suits stepped inside, their presence commanding immediate attention. One carried a sleek briefcase, while the other held a tablet in one hand, his expression unreadable. Amara's gaze flicked toward them, and her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Marcus never disappointed. The taller of the two men scanned the cabin briefly, before his eyes landed on Diana, who instinctively stepped forward to greet them. "Miss Lang?" the man asked, his voice low but firm. Diana nodded, her throat dry. "Yes. I am Diana Lang, the flight supervisor. Can I help you?" "We are with Corporate," the man replied, holding up an ID badge. "We need to speak with you and the rest of your team." Immediately Tom, who had been lingering nearby, froze mid-step. His face paled as he exchanged a glance with Diana, who looked equally unsettled. "Is there a problem?" Diana asked. Though she already knew the answer, the man did not respond immediately. Instead he gestured toward the galley. "We will speak privately now." Diana and Tom exchanged another uneasy glance before following the men into the galley, their movements stiff and uncertain. As the door to the cabin closed behind them, a ripple of murmurs spread among the passengers. Even Vanessa sat straighter in her seat, craning her neck to see what was happening. Amara, however, remained perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on her notebook. She did not need to see the conversation unfolding in the galley to know how this story would end. The gears were in motion and there was no stopping them. Now inside the galley the air was thick with tension. The two corporate representatives stood with practiced composure, their sharp eyes assessing Diana and Tom as if they were under a microscope. "We have reviewed the situation," the taller man began, his voice even but cold. "And we have spoken with key stakeholders regarding this flight." He glanced briefly at his colleague, who gave a curt nod before the man continued. "Effective immediately. Both of you are being removed from duty." Diana's eyes widened in shock. "Removed, but there is no room for negotiation." The man interrupted his tone, leaving no room for argument. "Your conduct has been deemed unprofessional and inconsistent with company policy. Further disciplinary action will be determined following a full investigation." Tom's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find words. His usual confidence had been replaced by sheer panic. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. "This is a misunderstanding. We did not do anything wrong." The second representative, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "We have reviewed passenger testimony and corporate records," he said firmly. "Your actions jeopardized the integrity of this flight and the airline's reputation. This decision is final." Diana felt her stomach drop, her years of service and carefully built reputation crumbling in an instant. "You are to leave the aircraft immediately," the taller man continued, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Security is waiting outside to escort you." Back in the first-class cabin, Amara turned her head slightly, watching from the corner of her eye as Diana and Tom were escorted away. A faint trace of satisfaction flickered across her face, before she quickly masked it, her focus returning to her notebook. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity barely concealed. Even Vanessa seemed momentarily stunned into silence. Amara did not need to say anything more. The story was already writing itself, exactly as she would expected. In the background, Vanessa Hale's indignant voice rose once again, though this time it barely registered. For Amara, she knew the battle was over, and with it, the war. The sound of the cabin door closing behind Diana and Tom cut through the air like punctuation, sharply ending the tension that had gripped the plane. For the first time since the ordeal began, a hush fell over the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves, though none dared to speak loudly enough to be overheard. Amara remained seated, her posture relaxed, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She was not the kind to revel in the moment. It was not in her nature to gloat. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered, the larger message this incident would send. This was not about revenge, it was about accountability. The two corporate representatives emerged from the galley and made their way down the aisle. The taller of the two paused beside Amara's seat, inclining his head respectfully. "Miss Brooks," he said softly, his tone professional but deferential. "Everything has been resolved. Please accept our deepest apologies for the inconvenience and the way you were treated. The individuals involved are no longer part of this flight." Amara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the swift action," she replied, her voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge that made the man straighten slightly. "However, I trust this won't end here. I expect a full review of the airline's policies and training procedures. This is not the first time I have seen something like this, and I doubt it will be the last." The man nodded quickly, his tone earnest. "Of course, madam, we will ensure that happens. You have my word." Amara nodded once, her attention already shifting back to her notebook. Her dismissive gesture made it clear the conversation was over. The man hesitated for a moment, then retreated down the aisle, leaving Amara to her thoughts. She did not need their promises. She had the influence to ensure they followed through, and she intended to use it. Across the aisle, Vanessa sat seething in her seat. Her face was flushed, her fingers clutching the armrest so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The smug satisfaction she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a simmering rage that seemed to radiate off her in waves. "This is ridiculous," Vanessa hissed under her breath. "Absolutely ridiculous." Beside her, Lydia leaned in cautiously, her voice barely audible. "Maybe it is best if we just let it go," she whispered. "It is not worth causing more trouble." Vanessa turned on her sharply, her eyes blazing. "Let it go? Do you realize what just happened? They threw me under the bus. I am a premier elite member. Do you have any idea how much I spend on this airline every year?" she sneered, jerking her chin toward Amara's seat. "And they are treating me like her," she spat, her tone dripping with venom. Lydia recoiled slightly, her gaze darting toward Amara. If Amara had heard Vanessa's outburst, she gave no indication of it. Her calm demeanor only seemed to inflame Vanessa further. "This is not over," Vanessa muttered darkly, her voice low but seething. "I will make sure corporate hears about this. I have connections." Lydia sighed, her unease growing. Vanessa's refusal to back down was beginning to feel less like determination and more like desperation, but she did not dare voice her thoughts, not with Vanessa in this state. The intercom crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's steady, composed voice filled the cabin. "We apologize for the delay. As a reminder, safety and customer satisfaction are our top priorities. We will be resuming our departure shortly. Thank you for your patience." The announcement, though routine in tone, felt like a shift, a signal that the chaos was finally coming to an end. Amara allowed herself a small, measured exhale, the gears of accountability were turning, and she knew this incident would not end here. It would ripple outward, triggering changes far beyond this single flight. Vanessa, meanwhile, sank deeper into her seat, her anger boiling beneath the surface. For all her bravado, she now found herself cornered, her every demand dismissed, and her influence rendered useless. The plane's engines hummed to life, and the faint sense of normality began to settle over the cabin. But the atmosphere still buzzed with the weight of what had transpired. Amara glanced out the window, the terminal lights shrinking in the distance. As the plane prepared for takeoff, she allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. This was not just a personal victory, it was a statement. The captain's announcement seemed routine on the surface, but Amara Brooks noticed the subtle shift in tone. A hint of finality. It was clear the flight crew had been instructed to prevent any further disruptions. The cabin doors were now firmly closed, and as the faint tension in the air began to dissipate, most passengers returned to their routines. But for Vanessa Hale, the captain's words were the last straw. She stood abruptly, her sudden movement drawing the attention of everyone around her. Her voice cut through the relative quiet, loud and indignant. "This is unacceptable," she declared, glaring down the aisle, as if daring the corporate representatives to reappear. "I have been a loyal customer of this airline for years, and this is how I am treated. I demand to speak to someone in charge now." Several heads turned her way, passengers exchanging uneasy glances. Even Lydia, seated beside her, looked mortified. She sank lower in her seat, as if trying to disappear entirely. Before anyone could respond, one of the corporate representatives re-entered the cabin, his expression unreadable. He approached Vanessa with deliberate calm, his voice steady but firm. "Mrs. Hale," he began, "we have been informed that your behavior has disrupted the cabin environment. Unfortunately, we must ask you to disembark the plane." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Vanessa's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she sputtered. "You are removing me for what?" "For standing up for myself." The man did not flinch. "Our priority is ensuring a safe and comfortable experience for all passengers. Your conduct has made that difficult. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the plane." Vanessa's face turned a deep shade of red, her anger boiling over. "This is outrageous. Do you have any idea who I am?" The man's demeanor remained unchanged. "Your status as a premier elite member has been noted, Mrs. Hale," he said. "However, it does not exempt you from following airline policies or respecting other passengers." For a moment, Vanessa looked as though she might argue further, but the murmurs spreading through the cabin made her hesitate. She glanced around, realizing for the first time that she had lost whatever sympathy she might have had. The other passengers' expressions ranged from disinterest to thinly veiled satisfaction. No one was on her side. Amara did not even look up from her notebook as Vanessa was escorted down the aisle, her protests growing fainter with each step. The cabin door opened briefly, the low voices of the waiting security guards filtering in before it closed again, leaving behind an eerie silence. The plane finally began its taxi to the runway. The hum of the engines returned, and with it the last remnants of tension seemed to evaporate entirely. Amara glanced out the window, watching the distant lights of the terminal shrink as they moved forward. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile, calm, satisfied and entirely self-assured. She had not said a word to Vanessa directly. She did not need to. Amara understood that true power did not require loud declarations or public victories. Sometimes it was the quiet resolve to stand firm and let the system correct itself. As the plane lifted off into the night sky, Amara leaned back in her seat, her thoughts already shifting to the work ahead. She knew this incident was just the beginning. There was much to be done to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Karma, she thought, has a way of working itself out. The cabin door had closed with a final resolute hiss when Diana Lang and Tom had been escorted off the plane. The murmurs that had rippled through the passengers earlier had quieted, and now their gazes shifted toward the first-class cabin, where Amara sat. Her calm demeanor remained unchanged, but her presence carried a weight that no one could ignore. Vanessa, sitting stiffly in her seat, let out a huff of disbelief. Crossing her arms, she muttered loudly, enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "Well, I hope they replace them with someone competent. This delay is ridiculous." Amara, who had remained silent through Diana and Tom's removal, finally looked up. Her gaze rested on Vanessa with quiet intent. There was no anger, no malice, only a steady, unyielding strength that seemed to cut straight through Vanessa's facade. "You still do not get it, do you?" Amara said softly, her voice carrying effortlessly in the tense cabin. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard by the sudden directness. "Excuse me, this was not just about a seat." Amara continued, her calm but firm. "It was about respect, about the way you, and others like you, think the world should bend to your will, no matter who it hurts." Vanessa Hale opened her mouth, her face flushed with indignation, but Amara Brooks raised a hand, silencing her. Amara's voice, calm yet sharp, cut through the tense air. "You assumed I was less than you because I did not fit the image you expected to see in this seat," she said, her words deliberate and cutting. "And you used your privilege to try to take something that was not yours." The other passengers sat in stunned silence, their gazes fixed on Amara. Her words hung in the air like a blade, slicing through Vanessa's composure. Vanessa's face reddened further as she stammered, her voice faltering. I did not mean you did," Amara interrupted, her tone firm but not angry. "And now you will live with the consequences." Before Vanessa could respond, one of the corporate representatives re-entered the cabin. His expression was unreadable as he approached Amara's seat. "Miss Brooks," he said respectfully, "we have taken care of the situation. On behalf of the airline, I would like to extend our sincerest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you experienced today." Amara nodded politely, though she did not smile. Her expression remained composed yet commanding. "I trust," she said, her voice steady, "that you will be conducting a full review of your staff's training and policies." "Absolutely," the man replied without hesitation. "We will be implementing new protocols immediately, and as a gesture of goodwill, the airline would like to offer you complimentary first-class travel for the next 2 years." Amara inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she said evenly, so that her tone neutral. "But what I really want is accountability, not just for me but for every passenger who has ever been made to feel less than because of who they are." The man nodded, his respect for her evident. "You have my word," he said. As the corporate representative turned to leave, Vanessa, her indignation boiling over, leaned forward. "Wait a minute," she snapped. "What about me? I am the one who has been inconvenienced here. I am a premier elite member. Do you have any idea how much money I have spent on this airline?" The representative turned back to her, his expression cool and unwavering. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice polite but firm, "your behavior today was documented by multiple witnesses. The airline has decided to revoke your premier elite status effective immediately." Vanessa's jaw dropped, her face turning pale. "You can't do that." "I have rights." "You do," the man replied calmly, "and so does every other passenger. Your actions today violated the airline's code of conduct, and we take that very seriously. Security will escort you off the plane now." The cabin erupted into whispers as 2 uniformed security guards appeared at the door. Vanessa protested loudly, her voice rising in pitch. "This is outrageous. You will be hearing from my lawyers," she shouted, demanding to speak to someone in charge. But her words fell on deaf ears. As the guards escorted her down the aisle, her protests grew fainter with each step. The cabin door opened briefly, the sound of low murmurs from the guards filtering in. Before it closed again, silence settled over the plane. The engines hummed as the plane finally began to taxi to the runway. The earlier delay was already fading into memory as passengers settled back into their seats. Amara gazed out the window, the soft glow of the city lights casting faint reflections on the glass. The silence around her no longer felt awkward, but reverent, though no one said it aloud. The other passengers seemed to recognize that they had witnessed something significant. Without raising her voice or resorting to anger, Amara Brooks had stood her ground and shifted the power dynamic entirely. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Amara leaned back in her seat, her notebook resting on her lap. She did not smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She had fought this battle not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. Weeks later, the airline released a public statement announcing new diversity and inclusivity training for all staff, along with stricter protocols for handling passenger disputes. The incident on Flight 612 to Geneva was never mentioned by name, but those who had witnessed it understood that it marked a turning point. This was more than just a personal victory for Amara, it was a broader lesson. Respect, as she had demonstrated, is not just a courtesy, it is a requirement. And for those who forget it, the consequences are inevitable. What started as an act of entitlement had ended in a powerful lesson in respect and humility. This story reminds us all, no matter who you are, treating others with dignity is non-negotiable. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Do not forget to like and share to spread the message. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.